Hello everyone, welcome to another anatomy video, and today we'll be discussing the digestive organs found in the abdomen. So one of the last terms that we discussed was the esophagus, and the esophagus carries the ingestia through the cervical part of the esophagus, which is found in the neck, down the thorax, and that part of the esophagus is called the thoracic part of the esophagus, and then into the abdomen, or the abdominal part of the esophagus. And it leads into this organ, which is the stomach. The stomach has a lot of external landmarks, which I'm going to point out right now. Right here we have this small little curve found on the superior portion of the stomach. This curve is called the lesser curvature of the stomach. On the inferior portion of the stomach, we have a larger curve that goes up and around to the very top of the stomach. This is going to be called the greater curvature of the stomach. The stomach itself is actually broken down into several portions. The portion that's closest to the esophagus, where I'm kind of circling in blue, this part of the stomach is called the cardiac part of the stomach. The portion of the stomach that has this large bulge, where I'm circling in green, this is called the fundus of the stomach. Just below the cardiac part and the fundus of the stomach is going to be the body of the stomach, and I'm kind of encasing this in yellow. So all of this is going to be the body of the stomach. And the last and final part of the stomach is located at the most distal end, which is right here in red. This right here is called the pyloric part of the stomach. And those are all the different parts and landmarks found on the external surface of the stomach, but we have a few more landmarks that we need to discuss found deep within the stomach. Once we can see the internal surface of the stomach, we see all these different folds, bumps, and grooves. They kind of look like wrinkles. Those are called gastric folds, or sometimes called gastric rugae. And these folds are important because as food is delivered into the stomach, it allows the stomach to expand and stretch out. Now, if we return to the pyloric part of the stomach, which is located right here in red, we can break this down into two separate parts. The part that is just after the body of the stomach, which I'm coloring in red, this is called the pyloric antrum. And the second part of the pyloric part of the stomach is located here in green, so it comes right after the pyloric antrum, and this is called the pyloric canal, which is responsible for funneling all the ingestia towards the pylorus. And finally, we get to the last portion of the stomach, which is located right here, and this is the junction between the stomach and the duodenum, and this is called the pylorus of the stomach. And the pylorus of the stomach has two different features. It has this opening right here, this little hole which leads from the stomach to the duodenum, and this opening is called the pyloric opening. And the muscle responsible for guarding this opening of the pylorus is called the pyloric sphincter muscle, and it's located around the pyloric opening. And those are all the different landmarks found in the stomach. So we can go ahead and move into the different parts of the small intestine. This model shows the first part of the small intestine, which we're going to cover, which is called the duodenum. And there are several other organs and vessels that surround the duodenum. Right here in blue is where the pylorus of the stomach would be, and it funnels ingestia into it. The most superior portion of the duodenum, located right here where I'm pointing, is called the superior part of the duodenum. right where the duodenum starts to bend and descend, so right here in green, this bending point is called the superior duodenal flexure. And flexure means bend, or the part where it curves down. So whenever you hear flexure, think of a bend or a curve. The portion of the duodenum that descends inferiorly, right here, this is called the descending part of the duodenum. Now, seeing that we have a superior duodenal flexure, we can also assume that this bend down here on the inferior portion is going to be the inferior duodenal flexure, and that's what it's called. Now we have this portion where it's just kind of going transversely or horizontally. This is called the horizontal part of the duodenum. And finally, the portion that goes upward is called the ascending part of the duodenum. Now the ascending part of the duodenum ends at this point right here. Again, we see another bend or curve. So we know this is going to be a flexure. Now at this point, this is the union between the duodenum and the jejunum, which is the next part of the small intestine. So we're going to call this the duodenojejunal flexure. Again, this is called the duodenojejunal flexure. So this portion right here is a continuation of the jejunum, which is the next part of the small intestine. So don't get confused with the ascending part of the duodenum with the jejunum, and then this point right here, which is the duodenojejunal flexure. Now before I move on and identify the jejunum and ileum, there are two more landmarks that I need to identify on the duodenum. Right here you could see this kind of white opening found on the descending part of the duodenum. This landmark is called the minor duodenal papilla. And this minor duodenal papilla has the opening of the accessory pancreatic duct, and that's where it secretes its fluids into the duodenum. Now just below it is another opening located right here, and this is called the major duodenal papilla. And this is the opening of the hepatopancreatic ampulla, which is a combination of the bile duct and the pancreatic duct, which I'll explain in my video of the accessory digestive organs. And those are all the landmarks located on the duodenum. Now we can go ahead and move on to the jejunum and ileum. In this image, we can see a much larger scale of the digestive organs. We can see parts of the stomach, we can see a little part of the duodenum, as well as the small intestine and the large intestine. Now, we already mentioned the duodenum, which is kind of hidden back here where this red arrow is. But the next part we need to learn is called the jejunum. Now, the jejunum consists of the small intestine that's between the duodenum and the ileum. And there's no specific landmark to distinguish the division between the ileum and the jejunum, but a good rule of thumb is the superior portion of the small intestine between the duodenum and the ileum is considered the jejunum. So anything above this portion right here, so all this where I'm kind of drawing out in red, this is going to be considered the jejunum. This means that this lower portion of the small intestine that I'm kind of coloring in blue, this is going to be considered the ileum. Now don't misspell ileum for ileum. They're pronounced the same, but remember, there's a bone called the ileum, and then you have this digestive organ, which is the most distal part of the small intestine, which is called the ileum, which is written with an E instead of an I, so remember that. Now just after the ileum, it inserts into the large intestine, more specifically inside the cecum. And the cecum is located right here. This is considered the cecum, which is the blind-ended portion, or like the dead-end portion of the large intestine. Now there's another landmark located in the cecum, but I'm going to go ahead and switch images to illustrate it. In this illustration, we can see the large intestine in its entirety, as well as the descending aorta and some peritoneum. Now the landmark that I wanted to identify that was located on the cecum is this little portion right here. It looks like a worm, so we know what worm is in Latin, which is vermis. So we're going to call this the Vermiform Appendix. Now, before I go any further in identifying parts of the large intestine, I want to make sure it's clear the different parts of the large intestine. Within the large intestine, there are 4 main parts that make it up. The first part is the cecum, which I already identified. The second part is the colon, which will be the next thing I point out. After that, we have the rectum. And the last part is going to be the anal canal. And those are all 4 parts that make up the large intestine. So we've already identified the cecum, so let's go ahead and identify the colon. So since we know that this part down here is going to be the cecum, following the cecum is the colon. The colon consists of all this area right all the way up to this point. So all this circled in green is called the colon. The first part is the part that goes upward. So this right here, we're going to call the ascending colon. Now the second part is this horizontally oriented part of the colon, and we're going to call this the transverse colon. The third part of the colon is the part that goes downward right here. This is called the descending colon. And the fourth and final part of the colon is the part that makes like an S curve, and that's called the sigmoid colon. Now you may have noticed that the colon, like the duodenum, has some bends. This top portion right here that I'm identifying in black, that's going to be called the right colic flexure because it's located on the right side. This right here on the other side of the colon is going to be called the left colic flexure. Now this straight portion of the large intestine that leads towards the anal canal that I'm coloring in blue, this straight about 6 inches long portion is going to be called the rectum. And finally at the very end we have the anal canal, which leads to the external opening called the anus. And then the external opening is just called the anus. Awesome, and those are all the different parts of the large intestine. Now that we've been able to identify the different parts of the colon, as well as the different sections of the large intestine, there are a few more additional landmarks that are located on the colon. Right here we see the little black arrows pointing to these yellow sacs of fat. These are called epiploic appendages of the colon. The next landmark that's unique to the colon is this long white strip kind of going right down the center of the colon. Now, although you can only see one in this illustration, there are in fact 3 of them that go around the entirety of the colon. This is a smooth muscle called tinea of the colon, or you can call it tinea coli. The last and final landmark I want to point out are these little round sacs around the colon. And they kind of form all these little bulges going throughout the entirety of the colon. And they're found on the ascending part, the transverse part, on all parts of the colon. These little bulges are called sacculations of the colon, or you can call it Hostra coli. And those are all the different unique landmarks found on the colon. And this concludes my video. Hope this video was helpful, and you guys take care.